the way that you want it to, instead of just going along with the default layout. And in most cases, you're going to want to make changes to the default layout. So let's look at some of the ways in which we can change this position property. Now, these are the 4 that I'm going to talk about. And the first one, the static position, we've actually already talked about it. All HTML elements are static in their position by default. And static just means go along with the HTML rules and keep to the default HTML flow. And that is what we see when we just have HTML without any CSS, or if we don't change this position property at all. Now, the next one is called the relative positioning. And what this allows us to do is to position the element that we select relative to how it would have been positioned had it been static. So in this case, on the left, we've got our Bacon fan site, and this is just the normal HTML flow. The image is being shown to the left, and it's below all the other elements, abiding by those 3 rules for HTML flow that we mentioned before. Now, if we select that image element and we change its position property to relative instead of static, which is the default, remember, and in addition to that, we say it should be pushed 30 pixels from the left of the previous position. This is how our image will end up being positioned. So whereas the left edge of our image used to be here, and that would have been its natural position, abiding by the HTML flow, now we're saying give that image 30 pixels of space between its left edge and where the left edge used to be. And there's 4 of these coordinate properties: the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And we can set values for them in order to determine how we want to move our element. So let's say that we've got a image that is positioned using relative layout. Then we set the top coordinate property to 20 pixels. That means it will get moved down by 20 pixels. And if we change the left property 20 pixels, then it'll get pushed right 20 pixels. If we change the right property 20 pixels, it'll get pushed left 20 pixels, and the bottom property as well. Now, there's 2 important things that you have to remember when you're dealing with relative positioning. The first thing is that when you move an element that has a relative position, say in this case we're pushing it down by 50 pixels, it doesn't affect the position of anything else on screen. It's as if the old position was kept and everything else just flows around it as if it was never moved. It's almost like this element left the ghost of itself where it used to be in order for all the other elements to keep their own positions. Now, the other thing to remember is that when we change the coordinate properties, for example, in this case, we're saying make the top coordinate property for this relatively positioned image 50 pixels. What that really means is that we're taking the top of where that image used to be and we're giving it a 50 pixel margin from the top of our current image. So if you think back to the box model, when we spoke about margins, this is the best way of thinking about these coordinates, because very often students tend to ask, if it's top 50, why is it not going up by 50? And why is it instead going down? And what is it top relative to? So if you get confused, have a look back at this video. So inside this code pen, I've created 3 divs that are colored red, blue, and yellow. And they each have a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. So essentially 3 squares inside a body element. I want to show you what changing the red div's position from static, which it currently is by default, to relative does. Now, by itself, changing this position property does nothing. It only starts doing something when you use one of the coordinate properties like left. So let's push it 20 pixels from the left. You can see that it just got nudged 20 pixels from the left of where it used to be. Now, I can also move it all the way to the right by saying something like left 600 pixels. So it's now got a margin between the left edge of where it used to be and the current left edge of 600 pixels. Now, if I say right 200 pixels, can you predict what will happen to my red square? So let's take a look, see if you got it right. So our red square has completely disappeared off the screen. Now, why is that? Well, because the previous right edge was here. And to have a margin between the current right edge and the previous right edge of 200 pixels pushes our red square all the way over to the left that you can't see it anymore. Now, some people might have thought that by saying right 200 pixels, then it should be somewhere around here because this is the right edge of the screen. But as we mentioned, the relative positioning is relative to where the element would have been displayed if it was just following the natural HTML flow. So it would have been here. And now there's a margin between its previous right edge and its current right edge of 200 pixels. But remember, as we said, that the relative positioning doesn't affect any other element on screen. So if I said top 50 pixels, it pushes it down by 50 pixels, but it doesn't affect the layout of any other element on screen. It doesn't, for example, push this blue square downwards or any other element. It's as if the ghost of the red square's past has stayed where it used to be, and it's only this newer version that's being moved around. So there's a lot of new concepts here. And before we move on, I just want to make sure that you're comfortable with this idea of relative positioning. So as a challenge, I want you to change the display property of the blue and the yellow squares so that they will show up in a row where we've got the red square, the blue square, and the yellow yellow square, and then I want you to move the red square to the right of the yellow square. And this is what you should end up with. Now, don't worry too much about the gaps between the squares. It's more important that you get the order right. So they're all on the same line, and it's blue, then yellow, then red. And you should be able to see most of the square. All right, so did you manage to do it? So the first thing that we needed to change was the display property of all three elements. So we're going to change it to inline block so that we can still change its width, but also have them show up in line. So let's add that line of code to all three divs. So now they're in the same line. So I want to get rid of this top and make them line up properly. But I now want to nudge the blue square to the position of the red square. So I'm going to make its position relative to where it should be, and I'm going to give it a right margin of 100 pixels. And I'm going to do the same thing to our yellow square. So I'm going to change its position to relative and also give it a right margin from its previous position to 100 pixels. And that nudges it left. Now, the final thing I have to do is to move the red square to the right by 200 pixels. So I can change its left margin to 200 pixels, and that moves the red square over to the right. Now, the reason why the spaces between our squares are inconsistent is because by making it an inline block, there's actually a little bit of space that gets added in by the browser. So we can see that if we get rid of all the position code, there's just a slight smudge of a space between each of the inline block elements. And that's what's making our gaps slightly inconsistent. But the important thing is that you manage to get the order of the blocks correct. So if you manage to get the squares to line up in this order, then that means you've successfully completed the challenge. In order to get the position more fine-tuned, we're going to look at different ways in the future. Now, in the next lesson, I want to show you another way of positioning your elements by using absolute positions. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can give our elements a relative position. So that's a position that's relative to where the element would have been had we followed the natural HTML flow. So for example, in this case, by making the image 30 pixels from the right relative to its previous position, then we're basically saying that there should be a right margin between the image and where it used to be in the value of 30 pixels. Now, I want to talk about a different way of positioning, which is using the absolute position. So in this case, I've got an image that's inside a div. So the div is colored red and it has a relative position. Now, our image is nested inside that div, and I've given it an absolute position. Now, if I change the right coordinate property to 30 pixels, it's not going to shift left by 30 pixels. No, in fact, it's going to shift to the right of the screen. And this is because with absolute positioning, we are positioning the element, so in this case, the image element, relative to its parent. And in this case, its parent is that red div. So we now have added a right margin of 30 pixels between the image element and the parent div. Now, admittedly, the naming is a little bit confusing, as I would have probably called absolute positioning relative positioning, because we're always specifying a margin that's relative to its parent. But I think the reason why they called it absolute position is because in most cases, the parent is simply the entire body of the web page. So the position, when you're using absolute positioning, looks like you're giving it a margin relative to the entire page, which looks like you're changing the absolute position of it. But don't get confused about the naming. Just remember that relative positioning means that you're adding a margin relative to where the element should have been. But absolute position means that you're adding a margin to its parent element. So in this case, we've still got our 3 divs inside a parent element, that's the body element. Now let's get rid of our display and our position for all of our divs, so that we now have 3 squares that are stacked vertically on top of each other, which are all block elements, so they are resting on different lines. Now, if I set the position of my first red square to absolute, and I give it a left margin of, say, 200 pixels, the first thing that you notice is that by using absolute positioning, it does affect the flow of your HTML. So unlike when we used relative positioning, where we left behind some sort of ghost element, where it still kept the positions of everything else the same, but when you're using absolute positioning, you're actually taking the element out of the flow of the document, and it's no longer considered a part of the natural flow of the document. So that's why the blue square and the yellow square have shifted up, because it's as if I've just gone and deleted that div. Basically, red is now dead to blue and yellow. It's like as if they never had a friendship before. But the cool thing is that I can now move this red square anywhere on screen relative to its parent, which is the entire body. So for example, I could say right 20 pixels, and that will just give it a right margin of 20 pixels from the right of its parent, which is the body. And so, as a challenge, I want you to complete exactly the same task, but it's going to be a little bit different this time. Now, this is what you're aiming for. You're aiming for 3 squares, still 100 pixel by 100 pixel, that are touching each other corner to corner. And this time, I want you to make it pixel perfect. So they are right up next to each other, touching each other exactly on their corners. And it should be yellow, then blue, then red. And you're going to use the absolute position system in order to do this. So pause the video and give it a go now. So in order to achieve the design that we want, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add position absolute to all of our divs. Now, the yellow is almost exactly where it's meant to be, apart from one slight problem. And this was a bit of a trick question in there to see if you remembered what we did before. You can see that we're trying to get the yellow to touch with the left and the top edge. Now, I appreciate it's a little bit difficult to see because of how bright that yellow is. But if you look carefully, you can see that there's definitely a margin there between the yellow and the edge of the screen. And the reason for that is because, remember, everything is nested inside our HTML body, and our browser has default CSS rules for the body, and we have to get rid of those if we want to have no margin. So let's first target the body and set the margin to be 0 around all 4 sides so that our yellow square can touch the edge. And that makes our maths a little bit easier when we're trying to figure out how to get the squares touching corner to corner. So we've got a yellow in the right position. The next thing is the blue. So if we're positioning the blue square relative to the parent, which is the body, then all we need to do is give it a left margin of 100 pixels and a top margin of 100 pixels. And now blue is touching yellow corner to corner. And finally, we can go to our red and we can change its top margin to 200 pixels and its left margin to 200 pixels. And we are now pixel perfect with our solution. And we've created the design that we wanted. So how did that go? You would have noticed that it's a lot easier moving things around using absolute positioning when you're just thinking about it being relative to the body. And in this case, if you wanted your squares to be touching each other, pixel perfect, with no space between them, then it's very, very easy to do. Because in this case, all 3 elements are positioning themselves relative to the same thing, which is the body of the web page, and not to different things like where they used to be. And this is usually a much easier way for people to think about layout. Although in most cases, you will find yourself using maybe a combination of both, especially when you want to keep the other elements on screen still in the same flow as what it used to be before you started positioning one element. So they're both really, really useful, and you'll see both of them really commonly across website CSS. Now, one thing to remember is that the parent doesn't always have to be the body. It can also be the closest parent that has a relative layout. So, for example, if we put another div around our red square and we set its position, so this is called container, we set its position to be relative and we don't change it. We're not going to touch it. But this sets up this container to be a perfect parent for our absolute positioning. So let's give it a width of, say, 300 pixels, height of 300 pixels, and let's give it a background color of gray. Now you can see this container. Now, you'll notice that the design for our web page has now changed, and quite dramatically so, because now our red square is a child of that parent container. And now it's defining its position relative to that gray container square. So if I delete that left 200 and instead I say right 20 pixels, it's no longer having a right margin of 20 pixels from the edge of the body, but it's now relative to its parent container. And even though our other squares are blue and yellow, are still relative to the body, because we haven't defined a vertical position for it, it's being pushed down by this element with a relative layout. So we can change this by giving it a top property of 0. And whenever you're using 0, you don't actually have to specify a unit like pixels or percent. And let's do the same for our yellow square as well. And let's push our red square over. And let's push our red square over so that it is right 0. And you can see that we've got exactly the same layout, but this time because red is nested in a container, we're using completely different code. And the beauty of this is that you can use containers to fine-tune the position of your elements on screen by using a combination of absolute and relative positioning. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we finish our section on positioning is I want to show you that last value, which is the fixed position. So, for example, if I change the yellow's position from absolute to fixed, and I say that it is fixed to the top, then if I scroll through the web page, it will stay in its current position. Now, I can show you this if I create some H1s in here, just to give ourselves a bit more space so that we can actually scroll through our website. So I'm just going to copy and paste a whole bunch of these. So we've now got a whole bunch of H1s and we can scroll through our web page. And you'll notice that the yellow div stays exactly where it is, fixed in its position relative to the body of the website. And it doesn't move despite all my scrolling. So this is really useful if you have a nav bar that you want to be fixed so that it follows the user as they scroll through your website. Or sometimes you might have a sidebar that will stay fixed, and this is how you would do it. So that's all I wanted to cover for the CSS position property. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can further improve our website by using what we've just learned. Now, let's take a look back at what we've got on our website and see how we can use some of the knowledge that we learned about positioning in order to make this website look the way that we want it to. Now, the first thing that we want to achieve is we want to center all of these elements, the image, the mountain image, as well as the text here in the H1 and also this subtitle. So the easiest way of centering elements is by tapping into a property called text align. And that property has to be set inside the parent container. So in this case, either in the top container or inside the body. So I'm just going to go ahead and center everything on screen by tapping into the body selector and saying text align center. If we hit save and we head back and we hit refresh, then you'll notice that all of our images, our H1 and our paragraph is now centered. Now, this works as long as we've got an inline block element, such as our images, or if we've got these full width block elements, like our H1 and our P tag, which are going from left edge to the right edge. Now, if I go into my code and I change the H1 to change its width to say only, I don't know, let's say 10%, then you'll notice that it's no longer being center aligned, despite the fact that it's still inside the body, which is asking for text align to be center. So what do we do in this case? Well, the other way of centering an element is by using the margin. So there is a value called auto, which when applied will center the element either vertically or horizontally. So in this case, if we're looking for horizontal centering, then we can say that the margin top is 0, the margin right is auto, the margin at the bottom is also 0, and the margin on the left is again auto. So I'm going to delete this margin top here and hit save. And if I refresh, you'll see that our element, despite being only 10% of the width of the screen, is now centered in the middle of our web page. And when you look at the box model, you can see that the top and bottom margins were set to be 0 by us, and the left and the right are set automatically to whatever amount it needs to be in order to keep it in the center. So very often, when you're finding yourself trying to center elements, you'll probably end up using one of these methods. So just to recap, text-align center inside the container or the parent element will center everything inside that doesn't have a width set. Now, if it is a block element and it has a width set, then you're going to have to center it using this auto value in the margin. So in this case, we can also shorten this by saying that the top and bottom needs to be 0 and the left and in this by saying that the top and bottom. So in this case, we can also shorten this by saying that the top and bottom needs to be 0 and the left and right needs to be auto. And that will not change this at all. And this is just one of those circle shorthands that you will begin to learn. And if you've forgotten how that worked, or if you're interested in learning more, then you can always check out the CSS docs on MDN for the margin, where they go through each of these, where if you only have a single value after margin, then that's all 4 sides. If you have 2, then that's top and bottom and left and right. If you have 3, then it's the top, left and right, and bottom. And if you have all 4, then that's just all 4 sides in a clockwise direction. So if you get confused or if you forgot how that works, then have a look over there. Now I'm actually going to undo and I'm going to revert back to margin top being 0 and text align being centered. And you'll see that this is what it will now look like. Now, the next problem we need to tackle is that these 2 images are acting as if they are inline blocks. And the cloud, because it's in the flow of the HTML file, is affecting the layout of the mountain. More specifically, I want this mountain to be right in the middle, and at the moment it's being pushed to the right by that cloud. So in order to fix this, we have to take this cloud out of the HTML flow. And once we've done that, then the mountain will go back to being centered. So can you remember how we can take an element out of the HTML flow by changing one particular CSS property? That is, of course, the position property that we're going to change. And we're going to change it from its current value, which is static, to absolute. And that is how we're going to remove it from the HTML flow. So inside our index.html, I'm going to give a class to our bottom cloud, and I'm going to call it bottom cloud. And while I'm here, I'm going to give a class to our top cloud, and I'm going to hit save. I'm going to head back over to our styles.css, and we're going to target that bottom dash cloud, and I'm going to set its position to absolute. Now, if I hit refresh, you can see that that cloud has been taken out of the flow. Absolute dash cloud, and I'm going to set its position to absolute. And it's kind of being placed more or less randomly on the screen. But more importantly, our mountain is now bang in the middle of the file, and this is exactly the layout that I want for it. So the next part is a challenge. And this is what you want to end up with if you manage to complete the challenge successfully. We've got our top cloud that's on the right and a little bit above the H1. And we've got our bottom cloud that's on the left and just between the text and the mountain image. And they are both taken out of the flow of the HTML document. So pause the video and give that a go now. Now, how did that go? So firstly, our bottom cloud at the moment has an absolute position. Now, in order to position it relative to something, one of its parents has to have its position set as relative. And if we don't, then it will be relative to the body. So in our case, I want us to be able to position our bottom cloud relative to this entire top container. So I'm going to set the position of our top container to relative. And I'm going to start off by giving our top container just a little bit of padding at the top so that we can push down this cloud and all of these contents just down by a little bit so that it's not all stuck at the top of the page. So to do that, we can add a padding top of 100 pixels. And that just pushes everything down a little bit. And then I'm going to add our top cloud as well. And I'm also going to take it out of the flow by changing its position to absolute as well. And now if we hit refresh, you can see our two clouds are kind of just floating around without doing very much. So now let's position them properly. So relative to our top container here, I want the top cloud to have a right margin of 300 pixels and a top margin of 50 pixels. And I want our bottom cloud to have a position left margin of 300 pixels and a bottom margin of 300 pixels from the bottom of its parent, which is of course the top container. So it will be from this line. And if we hit save and refresh, then this is what we will end up with. Now, before we do any further positional tweaking, we should really format the text, because by changing the font size, etc., we're going to affect the positioning of our elements as well. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can style our text using CSS. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, one of the most important decisions that you will have to make when you're designing your website is what are the fonts that you're going to choose? And a lot of web designers will start off by figuring out a color palette as well as a font scheme. So in this lesson, we're going to learn about how we can change the fonts for all of our text in our website. Now, there are two major font families, and that is the serif and the sans serif fonts. So you can tell serif and sans serif fonts are apart from each other by looking for these little feet at the edges of all of the letters. And these little feet are called serifs. Now, we can broadly define whether if we want a sans serif or a serif typeface for any text on our website. So let's go ahead and do that. If we go into our style sheet and we change the font family property for our body, then we actually affect all the text on our web page. And you can see that there's 5 major families listed here. Now, only 3 of which are you actually going to use. So we've seen serif and sans serif. Now, monospace is when each of the characters inside the text take up the same amount of width. And that's usually a typeface that we use for coding because it makes everything super easy to read. For example, if this word align was styled in a serif or sans serif typeface, then the I would be squished right next to the L and the G. But because all code is represented in a monospaced font, then you can more easily read each of the letters. So you'll use these two for your normal website styling. And when you do have code on your web page, sometimes people like to style it using monospace. Now, cursive and fantasy are 2 families that you're never really going to use. Firstly, because they have low readability, and secondly, because they generally don't look that great when used in the body of a website. So cursive is meant to be handwritten style of fonts, and fantasy is meant to remind you of Avatar, basically. So let's take a look at what each of these families look like. So let's first define a font family of serif and let's head back over to our website and we hit refresh, you'll notice that nothing happens. By default, we already have a serif family. You can see that at the end of the eyes, we've already got these little feet. Now, if we change that to sans serif, however, we will get a noticeable change, and those little feet or those little serifs now disappear and we have a different style. Now, for most browsers, the default serif is the Times font and the default sans serif is Arial. And this is the Arial font. Now, if we changed this to Fantasy, then it will still work. It just now looks like I'm producing the next avatar. So let's head back to a sans serif typeface. And I'm not really satisfied with just an Arial font. What if I want a different sans serif font? Let's say that instead of Arial, I would rather have Verdana as the font for my website. Now, what I can do is, instead of specifying just the sans serif broad stroke family, I can add a specific font or typeface in front. For example, if I wanted the Verdana font, then I can simply type Verdana and then have a comma and then separate that from the sans serif family. And now if we head back over here and refresh, you can see I'm now using the Verdana font. And what this line of code does is that it sets the font family for all the text inside the body, but it first asks the browser to try and render all the text in the Verdana font. Now, if for some reason the browser or the operating system that the user is using doesn't have this font installed, then it will default to whatever is the sans serif font that is installed on their system. Now, that's a little bit scary because that kind of means that I'm my system. Now, do whatever is the sans serif font that is installed on their system. Now, that's a little bit scary because that kind of means that I might think that I've designed my website to look like this, and I think it looks perfect just like this. But on somebody else's system or browser, they might be getting a completely different style with different font heights and just a different look and feel. So there is such a thing called web-safe fonts. Now, what this means is that there's a set of font families where most operating systems will be able to render it correctly. And for the serifs, that includes Georgia, Times New Roman. For the sans serif, that includes Arial, Comic Sans, Impact, etc. Although these are called web-safe fonts, and it's basically saying that if you choose these sets of fonts, then you have the maximum chance of getting it rendered correctly as you're seeing yourself when you're designing it. But actually, no font is 100% web-safe. And if you head over to cssfontstack.com, then somebody has actually painstakingly listed all of the fonts that are in common usage and what is the percentage of users who have it installed separated by their operating system. So as you can see, the font that most people have is Arial. So 99.8% installation on Windows, 98.7% on the Mac. Now that is really, really high. But for some other fonts, you'll see a difference between the Mac and the Windows operating systems. And we're not even including Linux users here. So for example, if you look at something like Helvetica, which is an Apple-specific thing, then on Windows, installation rate is really, really low. And on Mac, it's 100% because it comes pre-installed with all Mac OS. So what can you do if you want to use a font, but you're not sure if everyone has it installed, right? For example, if I want to use Helvetica, then there's only 7% of users on Windows who are going to see it rendered in that font. Well, then you would need fallbacks. So if we click on this little icon here on Font Stack, then we actually copy a set of fallbacks for this Helvetica font. And if I go ahead and paste that and replace our font family, then you can see that we have a stack of fallbacks. So I'm basically saying that I want the font family to be Helvetica Neue if they have it. And if they have an Apple system, then it's very likely that they will have this font installed. If they don't have it, then default to the next best thing, which is Helvetica. And if they don't have that, then default to Arial. And finally, just go with whatever sans serif they've got installed if they don't even have Arial, which is very unlikely. But you can see how we're going from specific to less specific, and all the while ensuring that we're getting roughly a similar sort of typeface and similar sort of feel, no matter which fonts the user have installed or not installed. So if we hit save and we go back to our website, then you can see that on the Mac, I do indeed have Helvetica Neue installed, and that's what's currently being rendered on screen. But say if I was on Windows, then I might be seeing Arial in this case. And you can go ahead and give it a go and have a look at these font stacks and copy them over to your webpage and see what you're able to get. Now, what if we were even more picky as designers? What if I really want everybody who looks at my website to see exactly the same thing as I designed it? I want them to see the design that I intended instead of whatever font it is that they happen to have installed. And for example, if I was using Helvetica, then pretty much like 93% of Windows users are just going to see Arial. What if I really hate Arial? What can I do to ensure that everybody has the same viewing experience with regards to the fonts on my website? Well, you could use something called font embedding. So if we head over to fonts.google.com, then you can see that they've got a whole bunch of font families that you can choose from. And these are all fonts that are free for commercial use that you can simply embed into your website. And there's a large choice of font families that you can pick through. So you can choose whether if you want just serif fonts to look through or sans serif. They have these cool articles about which fonts go well with which, and a whole bunch of really, really useful stuff actually. But in my case, I already know what it is that I want. I want the font called Merriweather for my body. So I'm just going to add this plus sign. And this is a pretty kind of serif font. If you click on it, it actually shows you what the characters look like, who designed it, what it's about, what is the usage currently, what are the different styles, different weights, what do they all look like. It's even got things like loading speed and popular pairings, for example. So this is one of the fonts that I want, and that's going to be for the body text. So I'm just going to go ahead and click add. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a few more different fonts before I show you how we're going to incorporate this. So the other one that I'm going to pick up is a handwriting font actually. It's called Sacramento, and this I'm going to use as the font for my H1. So a very stylish sort of font where we don't really need people to read it that clearly. So it's not like a body font where it would be quite painful to try and read through, 300 words that are all styled like this. So let's go ahead and add that too. So we've got now 2 selected. And the last thing that I want is my main heading font. And that is going to be a sans serif. And one that I'm quite partial to is the Montserrat. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as well. So now I've got 3 font families selected, and I can embed it into my website as easily as copying this link and pasting that at the top of my index.html. Just going to paste that link in there. And this specifies a location where if users don't have these fonts already installed or cached on their system, then the browser will take them to this location and grab those fonts for them. And then if we go into the style.css, then I can specify a font family that I want to use. So the one that I want for my body is the Merriweather font. And I'm going to paste that in here. And it will default to serif if something terrible happens, say the internet connection went down in the middle of downloading the font, etc. But you can see it's not a large font stack because in pretty much 99.99999% of the time, this is the font that everybody is going to see because we are embedding it instead of presuming that people already have it. Now, for my H1, I'm going to use the Sacramento. And for my H2 and also H3s, I'm going to use the Montserrat. So let's go ahead and put those in there, and let's just hit Beautify to rearrange everything. And let's hit Save, take ourselves back over to our website, hit refresh, and voila. Our text is now beautifully styled using the fonts that we chose from Google Fonts. So feel free to have a mess around with the different, voila. Our text is now beautifully styled using the fonts that we chose from Google Fonts. So feel free to have a mess around with the different fonts that you might like or you might want to incorporate to your website, and then simply add them to your selection, include the link in your index.html, and start using them in your CSS like so. Now, in the next lesson, I want to go and do a deep dive on different fonts and different typefaces. What are the different families and how they came about? So just a lesson on one of the most crucial parts of digital design, and that's, of course, typography. So if you're interested, then that is what you will get on the next lesson. If you're not interested, then you can feel free and go ahead and skip ahead to the next lesson where we explore some of the other font and text properties that we can use to style our text on our website. So I'll see you on the next lesson.